For decades, the thrill of a roller coaster ride was anchored by the safety of a seat. You sat down, you locked in, and you held on tight. It was a formula that worked flawlessly. But in the 1980s, amusement parks began experimenting with a new kind of adrenaline rush by asking a radical question. What if you didn't sit at all? What if you stood? In 1984, Six Flags Over Mid-America, now Six Flags St. Louis, decided to give it a shot. They took the River King mine train and converted it into one of the country's first stand-up roller coasters, naming it Railblazer. It used much of the same track, but the trains were swapped for new upright cars equipped with futuristic restraints meant to keep riders standing as they flew through high-speed curves. It was marketed as state-of-the-art, but in reality, the ride barely lasted 3 weeks.
In St. Louis, Missouri, the Railblazer stand-up roller coaster has not rolled 1 inch since Stella Holcomb lost her life while riding it Sunday night.
On July 9th, Stella Holcomb and her husband Carl, visiting from Indianapolis, got on the Trailblazer, riding in the very back row. Their teenage daughter and her boyfriend were just in front of them. But halfway through the ride, right after the second lift hill, where the train twisted into a tight spiral, Stella was gone. According to Carl, they had been holding hands when the car jerked violently, and Stella was ripped from her seat, nearly pulling him out with her. Witnesses saw her fly from the ride, hit a tree, and fall to the ground below. She died later that day. When the train pulled back into the station, all of Stella's restraints were still locked in place. Park officials claimed she must have fainted. Maybe her body just went limp and she slipped through. But Carl didn't buy that. His wife had no medical history to suggest that, and the autopsy backed him up. Rumors spread quickly. Some even pointed fingers at Carl, though there was never any evidence to support those claims. The far more likely truth was that the Trailblazer's restraints were fundamentally flawed. They could appear locked, yet they couldn't actually hold someone during the wild turns. Trailblazer was shut down almost immediately. The stand-up cars were scrapped, and the track was restored to its original sit-down form. The entire experiment was over in less than a month. Now, this next one that I'm about to show you is perhaps one of the deadliest days in amusement park history. It was June 9th, 1991, and at the Kings Island Amusement Park, 22-year-old Timothy Benning leaned toward an Oktoberfest beer garden pond to splash his friend. But he was about to make the most critical, painful, and fatal error he would ever make. The water had been electrified by a faulty submerged pump with exposed wiring. As soon as his hand grazed the water, the shock knocked him unconscious, causing him to fall face first into the shallow water. When his friend and a park security guard jumped in to try and save him, both were electrocuted. Witnesses watched as CPR failed for both of them. His friend, Bill Haithcote, and security Robertson both died, but somehow Timothy survived, albeit with severe burns. The pump itself lacked a ground fault circuit breaker, meaning a $20 fix could have prevented the deaths.
Frightening situation from last week at Kings Island. Well, Mason police have now identified the man.
But Kings Island wasn't out of the woods yet. Just 1 hour later, 32-year-old Candy Taylor boarded Flight Commander alone. The ride's open-air pod spun riders 70 feet high using joystick controls, but suddenly, Taylor's capsule rolled sharply left. When the pod inverted, she slipped through a gap between the seat divider and restraint, falling headfirst onto the concrete and dying. Her blood alcohol content was measured at 0.30%, 3 times Ohio's legal driving limit. Her limp body simply slid past the restraints, exposing a fatal design flaw. By midnight, helicopters had airlifted 3 bodies from the park.
Meanwhile, at Kings Island near Cincinnati, the investigation continues into 2 bizarre incidents that left 3 people dead.
OSHA fined Kings Island $23,500 for electrical violations at the pond, while Flight Commander reopened in 1992 with modified restraints and joystick guards. Neither incident triggered permanent ride closures until public backlash became too serious to ignore. The whole incident was deemed Black Sunday by the local media. And that takes us to another park that should have been closed far earlier than it was. There was no ride at Action Park that was even slightly safe, but the Alpine slide was especially asking for trouble. This 2,700-foot concrete, fiberglass, and asbestos track snaked down a steep New Jersey mountainside with sleds controlled by a brake lever that riders quickly learned offered two speeds: agonizingly slow or death awaits.
It had a stick, and ostensibly, you're supposed to be able to pull up on a stick as a brake, push down on it to go faster. But one thing that I learned was very true. These sleds were often broken.
It was such a notoriously dangerous ride that staff would often joke about it, but guests in bathing suits rarely received warnings beyond a vague sign about riding at their own risk. On July 8, 1980, 19-year-old George Larson Jr. boarded a sled for his ride. What he didn't know was that the brake was broken. Seconds after he left the start point, the vehicle veered off the track, hurling him 25 feet into rocks, head first. He died 8 days later from his injuries. The park owner, Gene Mulvihill, immediately spun the narrative, claiming George was an employee riding at night in the rain, absolving Action Park of any and all liability. The only problem was that none of it was true. George had worked at the adjacent ski resort months earlier, but wasn't employed by the park that summer, and the accident occurred in daylight with no rain. This was just a classic case of disaster waiting to happen, and it finally happened. But nothing really came of it. State regulators never investigated. Gene was such an influential figure in town that nobody wanted to go after him or the park. A fabricated insurance scheme using a Cayman Islands shell company let him dodge all lawsuits. George's family eventually settled for $100,000, forced into silence by legal threats. Meanwhile, the slide remained open for years, remaining an insurance company's nightmare. Riders continued to crash into walls, lose teeth, or break bones, with 14 fractures and 26 head injuries reported in 1984 and 1985 alone. Gene's team constantly dismissed injuries as rider error, even as they quietly repainted pool bottoms to spot drowned bodies faster. By the time the park closed in 1996, 6 people had died across its attractions, but not a single executive faced prison time for any of it. And just when we think we've seen the worst, we head from one disaster to another. In January 2023, a tourist was enjoying a high-altitude cliff swing in the Lingyang Mountain Scenic Area, Ningbo, China. This swing, perched high above the ground, promised an adrenaline rush with its breathtaking views and the thrill of soaring through the air. However, during the first swing, disaster struck. As the chair swung back, part of the traction rope detached from the mechanism, trailing dangerously behind the rider's seat. Panic spread among bystanders as they screamed for the operator to stop the ride. The rider, gripping the seat for dear life, could feel the danger with every passing second. Each swing of the chair sent him closer to the risk of falling, and with every swing back and forth, his situation grew more perilous. During one of the swings, the rider's leg collided with the steel frame of the swing with a bone-shattering crash as he descended. The impact was terrifying, but miraculously, he did not fall. As the chair swung back upward, the rider's leg once again crashed into the frame, the painful thud echoing through the air. The rider, despite the intense pain, managed to hold on tightly, determined not to let go. With the chair continuing its erratic swinging, the rider remained in danger, but after a nerve-wracking few moments, he was finally escorted safely from the chair. The ride was immediately halted, and all operations were suspended. Technicians quickly arrived on the scene to inspect the swing and begin repairs. The rider was rushed to the hospital, where it was determined that he had broken his leg and would require surgery. Despite the painful injury, he survived the ordeal, though it was a traumatic experience for both him and the witnesses. The ride was taken out of service for a thorough inspection to ensure no further safety issues would arise in the future. But this wasn't the only swing that caused trauma to those who dared sit in it. Another incident would show just how dangerous these attractions could really be. In Russia, a man was spinning 2 children on a 360-degree swing when it suddenly began to spin uncontrollably. At first, the ride seemed normal, accelerating to achieve full rotation. But soon, It became terrifying as it wouldn't stop. What began as fun turned into a nightmare, with the children's laughter turning into horrifying screams. The ride continued to spin faster and faster as onlookers screamed for the operator to shut it down, but nothing worked. The rapid rotation made it look like the children were going through astronaut training. After several minutes and many failed attempts, operators finally cut the power wires, bringing the ride to a gradual stop. The children were escorted away by doctors on standby, but fortunately, they were unharmed. But once again in this next disaster, it's a child who becomes the victim of a malfunctioning ride, this time leading to a nightmare that could have been prevented.
Only a new ride that is the tallest of its kind in the world, that soars to the top in a single bound, then blasts back down in a zero-gravity freefall.
In June 2007, 13-year-old Caitlin Laysitter was waiting in line for a second ride on Six Flags Kentucky Kingdom's Superman Tower of Power. This ride, a 177-foot drop tower, launches riders upward before sending them plummeting back down at 54 miles per hour. The ride's mechanism was simple. The gondola ascended with steel cables connected to pistons in the tower, while emergency brakes were in place to stop operations if any sensors detected irregularities. But during Caitlin's second ride, disaster struck. As the gondola began its climb, one of the cables snapped. In a horrifying moment, the severed cable whipped around Caitlin's neck and legs, pulling her violently. Riders screamed in panic, but the operators delayed the emergency stop for a critical 10 seconds. By the time the brakes were activated, the gondola had reached its peak and entered freefall, making it far too late to prevent the disaster. During the 154-foot drop, the loose cable tightened, severing Caitlin's left femur and amputating both of her feet above the ankles. Miraculously, the cable around her neck slipped off just in time, preventing further fatal injuries. The subsequent investigation uncovered a serious lack of maintenance protocols at the park. For years, technicians had used cornstarch to reduce cable slippage, instead of the cotton rags mandated by the manufacturer's manual. The cornstarch caused severe corrosion, leading to the catastrophic failure. As a result of this tragedy, Kentucky banned miners from operating thrill rides altogether. As we've seen before, mechanical failures on amusement rides can lead to catastrophic consequences, and this next incident serves as yet another chilling reminder of the risks that come with thrill-seeking. On July 8, 2021, during the National Cherry Festival in Traverse City, Michigan, a disaster occurred. The Magic Carpet ride, also called the Flying Carpet, had been operating smoothly when suddenly it began to sway uncontrollably. The ride, which features a long swinging arm with a passenger platform, moves back and forth, often performing a full 360-degree loop. However, on this day, something went wrong. As the ride continued its motion, the entire structure began swaying violently, almost tipping over. The operator quickly shut off the power and jumped clear of the controls, but this didn't stop the ride immediately. The momentum kept it swinging. Scared riders began screaming for help as bystanders rushed to the base of the ride. 15 to 20 people grabbed onto the fencing and guardrails, using their collective weight to stabilize the ride until it came to a complete stop. Once the motion died down, the safety restraints didn't release until staff manually unlocked the harnesses, helping each rider off one by one. Miraculously, no injuries were reported. The ride was dismantled the following morning and sent back to its manufacturer for a full inspection. Now, we shift from mechanical failures to a completely different kind of danger. This time, the threat isn't from a ride malfunction, but from something maybe even darker: the actions of a living being.
Tillicum the Orca has died after more than 2 decades at SeaWorld Orlando, where he gained notoriety for killing a trainer in 2010.
One of the most popular shows at SeaWorld Orlando was the Dine with Shamu show, which promised guests an intimate glimpse into the bond between trainers and orcas. Guests would dine poolside as trainers guided the whales through choreographed behaviors, reinforcing the illusion of harmony. It was meant to be a cute, fun vacation memory for many, but on February 24, 2010, the routine took an unexpected and tragic turn. Veteran trainer Dawn Bronchot, a 16-year SeaWorld employee, was beside Tilikum, a legendary 12,000-pound orca with a history of fatal aggression. During a post-show interaction, she was rubbing the whale's head when he suddenly grabbed her ponytail or arm and dragged her underwater. Witnesses provided conflicting accounts. Some claimed Tilikum grabbed Dawn's hair, while others said he seized her arm, depending on where they were seated. The attack lasted for 45 minutes as Tilikum refused to release Dawn's body, avoiding staff attempts to corral him with nets and food rewards. But this aggression should have come as no surprise. Internal records showed that SeaWorld had documented over 100 incidents of orca aggression since 1988, with 2 incidents specifically involving Tilikum. In 1991, he had drowned a trainer in Canada, and in 1999, a man's body was found draped over him. Despite these incidents, SeaWorld continued to use Tilikum in performances, claiming that protocols had been modified to protect trainers. These changes mainly involved prohibiting trainers from swimming with him, but they were still allowed and even encouraged to be in close contact during training sessions on shallow platforms, like the one where Dawn tragically died. The autopsy revealed that Dawn's cause of death was drowning and traumatic injuries, including a severed spinal cord, fractured ribs, and her scalp forcibly torn from her skull. SeaWorld was fined $75,000 for willfully exposing trainers to danger and was forced to implement physical barriers between whales and staff. Tilikum remained in captivity, performing in shows until his death in 2017. But Dawn's death brought intense scrutiny to marine parks, partly fueled by the disturbing 2013 documentary Blackfish, which linked orca captivity to psychological trauma and violence. By 2016, SeaWorld phased out theatrical orca shows, but continues to house Tilikum's largely inbred offspring to this day. From the tragic death at SeaWorld, where the dangers of captivity were exposed, we now turn to a different kind of disaster.
Join us.
Alton's Tower Smiler roller coaster, promoted as the world's first 14 inversion ride, was designed to disorient riders with corkscrews, dive loops, and a cobra roll, all tangled around a spider-like structure. What made it especially unique was the operation of 5 trains simultaneously, theoretically cycling 960 riders per hour, all under the watch of automated safety systems. However, on June 2, 2015, with the park unusually busy, engineers attempted to add a 5th train to manage the overwhelming crowds, but the ride had already suffered technical faults. Not long before, a test train had stalled mid-circuit, yet the staff failed to notice, misinterpreting the ride's control panel and manually overriding the safety protocols without physically verifying that the issue was resolved. Just minutes later, a loaded train collided with the stalled train at 50 miles per hour, crushing the front row completely. 2 young women, Leah Washington and Vicky Balk, lost their legs below the knee. Other riders sustained shattered knees, internal injuries, and a collapsed lung, and were left screaming in pain as the coaster continued its forward and backward motion.
I've heard of people coming off at that point anyway. They just stopped the ride and then they helped them down. So I've heard of that, so I just thought that's what had happened, but then there was a massive clank and we set off.
The investigation revealed a catastrophic failure in safety culture. The park had no formal risk assessments, poor staff training, and no protocol for overriding the ride's computer. Engineers, working under these flawed procedures, assumed the system had made an error, not that a train had been stranded. To save face, Alton Towers initially blamed human error, firing a ride operator for the incident. However, prosecutors found that the park's lack of proper systems, not individual mistakes, was at fault. Merlin Entertainments, the parent company, pleaded guilty to health and safety breaches and received a record £5 million fine. The Smiler reopened in 2016 with upgraded brakes, wind speed limits, and emergency access points. But for the survivors, the changes came too late. As one lawyer said, "Money alone will never replace limbs." Keeping that in mind, we head straight into the next disaster.
En México vamos con otras cosas. Continúan hospitalizadas las dos mujeres que resultaron heridas por el descarrilamiento de uno de los vagones de un juego mecánico en la feria de Chapultepec. Dos hombres murieron.
On September 28, 2019, the Guima roller coaster at Mexico City's La Feria de Chapultepec was operating as it had for 22 years. The ride was known for its 3 vertical loops and speeds over 50 miles per hour, having operated across 3 continents before landing at the park. But at 2:30 p.m., the last car of a 5-car train derailed mid-loop. Onlookers watched as the car flipped upside down, slammed into a support beam, and plunged 33 feet. 2 young men died instantly from severe head trauma, 2 women survived with serious injuries, and 6 others suffered shock. It was surprising that this had never happened before. Maintenance logs revealed that operators were aware of many problems with the ride: corroded tracks, misaligned joints, and screws that didn't fit the ride's specifications. The park's management was usually ignoring daily safety checks across all rides. In fact, the ride was only 58% operational, yet it continued to operate. The ride's manual explicitly prohibited operating with damaged track welds or loose bolts, conditions that had been present for months with no acknowledgement. The park's operating license was immediately revoked, forcing it to permanently close on October 13, 2019. By 2023, demolition crews dismantled the site, replacing it with an urban park. The incident caused so much fear that attendance at Mexico City's amusement parks dropped by 30% in the aftermath. Guima's remnants were shipped to Indiana Beach, U.S. for refurbishment and a chance at a second life, albeit one far safer. And with that, we head to a few disasters that took place in some of the most famous parks in the world, from Disney. It almost sounds impossible that something like this could ever happen in such a well-known place, but nothing could be further from the truth.
Diffuse brain injury, which was a massive brain injury, and the other was a skull fracture extending from his facial fractures into his carotid artery.
On Christmas Eve 1998, hundreds of holiday visitors waited at Disneyland's Frontierland dock to board the sailing ship Columbia, a 110-foot replica of America's first globe-circling vessel. The attraction navigates a man-made river on an underwater track, but typically docks using hemp ropes designed to snap if the ship approaches too fast. However, on this day, workers inexplicably used a cheaper nylon rope, elastic and unyielding. As the Columbia neared the dock, cast member Christine Carpenter secured the nylon line to a cast iron cleat bolted to the ship's aging hull. The vessel was speeding, partly due to the distracted captains unaware of the situation. Christine anchored the line as intended, but the rope quickly stretched taut, and disaster followed. At 10:40 a.m., the force ripped the cleat right out of the rotted wood, launching it like a cannonball into the crowd. It struck Luanfi Dawson in the face, fracturing his skull and causing his brain tissue to hemorrhage. The impact also hit his wife, Louis Thuy Vuong, who collapsed beside him, her jaw torn open from the impact. Witnesses described seeing chunks of flesh and blood pooling on the dock. Anaheim police arrived hours later, but Disney had already pressure-washed the scene, effectively covering up the damage. The investigation confirmed that Disney had forced employees to substitute breakable hemp with durable nylon to save costs. The addition of untrained staff, lack of communication, and rotting ship infrastructure only made the situation worse. The cleat's bolts broke under tension. It was never meant to bear such force. Dawson was brain dead for 11 hours before being taken off life support, and Vuong endured years of reconstructive surgery and trauma. Disney paid $25 million to settle the family's lawsuit, and OSHA fined them for safety failures. While the park implemented emergency bells, rewrote docking protocols, and stationed officers at the site, the Columbia still sails today, always with hemp ropes. Now, let's dive into yet another disaster in one of Disney's parks. On June 25, 1985, the Disney World Monorail Silver arrived at the Epcot Center station with a flat tire. Before the next journey, staff replaced it with a backup tire, but minutes into the following trip, that backup tire also went flat. This time, the passengers weren't so lucky. With no tire to separate them, the metal wheel rim began scraping against the concrete beam, causing sparks that ignited the tire. Smoke quickly filled the car, and panic spread among the passengers. The monorail operates on an elevated beamway with no ground-level exits, so evacuation became extremely difficult. Worse still, there were no onboard fire detection systems, emergency exits, or evacuation plans. Guests were trapped 30 feet above the ground as the smoke continued to fill the vehicle. The pilot radioed for help, but the longer they waited, the slimmer their chances of survival became. Two brave passengers decided to take matters into their own hands. They kicked out the windows and forced open a door to reach a hatch leading to the roof. On the roof, they helped everyone escape, pulling people from other cars and guiding them down to the track. Fortunately, no one died, but 7 passengers were hospitalized due to smoke inhalation, and others sustained minor injuries that were treated on site. The last car was completely burned, and the second-to-last car suffered significant damage. In response to this incident, Disney World implemented new fire safety measures, and monorail tires are now inflated with inert nitrogen to reduce the risk of fire. And that takes us to the last one in this series of horrifying occurrences, once again at Disney. On February 14, 1999, 65-year-old part-time custodian Raymond Barlow was cleaning one of the Skyway platforms about an hour after the park opened. Unaware that the system was about to start, other employees began the Skyway operation for the day. It was a decision that would prove fatal. Startled by the fast-approaching gondola, Raymond reached out to grab it and try to climb inside, but he slipped and fell 40 feet to the ground. He hit a tree on the way down before landing in a flower bed. He was pronounced dead shortly after. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, ruled that the area where Raymond Barlow had been working violated federal safety codes. Disney was fined $4,500, and the Skyway ride, which had already been scheduled for closure, was permanently closed in November of that year. Now that was all for today, folks. If you enjoyed these horrifying clips, click to see more on the video on screen.